You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 177. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. What does every law student need to know about the in-firm interview process? This is the question that I asked myself in preparing for today's podcast episode. It is early fall here in Canada, and across the nation, the question of in-firm interviews is on the top of mind of many law students, particularly second-year law students. This is the time of year where you're hearing about or thinking about where you will be going for your in-firm interviews. And it is a process that can set you up for your very first job in a law firm. And the process itself can feel a little bit daunting. It can feel a bit mysterious. It can feel very stressful. And what I want to create for law students is a podcast episode that will help them, that will help you navigate this process. So welcome to the podcast. If you are a longtime listener and the process of interviewing for your first law job is well behind you, love having you here. You are more than welcome to stay for the episode. If it's not really something that you're interested in hearing about further, I completely understand and invite you to rejoin us next week. I would love to have you back. If it's not a process that relates to you, but you have someone in your life, someone who maybe is just starting out at law school or who is going through the process themselves, I would invite you to please share this episode with them. I think it's something that will really help them to gain clarity, to feel more confident and less stressed as they navigate the in-firm process. Now, for all of you who have joined who are students, maybe this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, I welcome you. I am so glad to have you here. I'm so glad we have this opportunity where I can help you navigate something that might feel really overwhelming and stressful. In terms of my background, I am a former practicing lawyer. I spent about a dozen plus years practicing mostly as a commercial litigator in a large national firm. I too went through the process of in-firm interviews. It was many years ago, back in 2002. Some things have changed, other things have not changed. I've been on both sides of that table. I've been through the process as a student. I then was an interviewer while I practiced law. So I interviewed students just like you who were looking for their first summer position. And since practicing law, I have started a coaching practice. So I think I'm about 6 years into my coaching practice where I work with primarily lawyers. I do work with students, but primarily lawyers to help navigate their legal careers from transitioning roles to increasing their practice management skills, to leadership, to business development. And so I'm just thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with you at this stage of your career to help you set yourself up for success by navigating this process of getting your first law job through the in-firm interview process. So I've boiled down today's podcast episode into 5 different points that I think are highly relevant that I would love to share with you as a student going through this process. Now, in addition to today's podcast episode, I also have a guidebook. It's a written book. It is a downloadable book. It is free, and it's something I would invite you to download for yourself as another tool to help you prepare for in-firm interviews. There is a link to that book, which will be provided along with the notes that go along with this podcast episode. If you can't find it, send me an email and I'll send you the link so you can download the book. I will be referring to it because it has additional information, and I'll share that with you along the way as we go through today's episode. So with that, dear student, I am going to start with point number 1, which is I would like to acknowledge you. I would like to congratulate you. I would like to celebrate you on getting to the point that you are at currently, which is you have an in-firm or more than one in-firm interviews. It takes a lot to get to that place. All of the education that you've gone through, your first year at law school, passing all of your exams, getting the grades that you need to get the interviews in the first place. You have gone through the process of researching law firms. You have submitted applications. You have written cover letters. You have prepared your CV. You've downloaded your transcripts or sent them over or whatever it is that you needed to do in order to tick all the boxes through the application process. You have met deadlines to do that. You may have also done additional networking, additional research. You have taken a large number of steps. You have cleared very many hurdles in order to get to the position that you're in right now. And before we go any further, I would love to acknowledge that. I would love to celebrate that about you. And I would love for you to acknowledge and celebrate that about yourself. This is no small feat. You already have demonstrated that you are highly capable, that you are highly skilled. And let's take a moment to reflect on that. Regardless of what happens in this process, you are capable, you are smart, and you will succeed. So just wanted to say that right off the bat. You have a number of really great skills that have gotten you to the place that you are now. You will use those skills throughout the in-firm interview process, and I invite you to also consider that you will be building on those skills and developing new skills as you navigate the process. So you will use the skills that got you here, and you will also be developing those new skills that will get you there. And listening to this podcast episode is a great opportunity for you to be thinking about what those skills are going to be, what you're going to do through this process that will lead it to be a successful process for you. That brings us to step 2, which is to take a step back and put this whole in-firm interview process into perspective, right? This is something that is happening in your professional and academic life currently. Now, I work with lawyers at various stages of practice who are transitioning jobs. And outside of the in-firm interview process, it looks quite different, right? It's less formal in many cases. It's you applying for that job not with dozens of others or hundreds of others at the same time. The timelines are different, etc. The in-firm interview process is highly unique because it is this highly structured machinery which serves as a mechanism to place law students who are currently in law school with law firms that are looking to hire those students for the upcoming summer and then later for articling. So it is highly unique. What it looks like then is that you have firms who are all hiring at the same time. You have students who are all applying for jobs at the same time. And what this can lead to is this really kind of unusual dynamic, right? There's almost this heightened sense of urgency because the timelines are all there. They're all consistent. Call date is all in one place. You have all gone through that OCI process, right? Where it's been very time oriented. Callback day where you learn about your in-firm interviews. So that is very systematic, right? It all happens at the same time. The interviews are all happening at the same time. So it creates this sense of urgency, which is just inherent in the process itself. It can also lead to a sense of potentially competitiveness between students or comparison because everybody's going through the process at the same time and you're learning about where your colleagues, your classmates, where they are interviewing. And you might see that there are some students who have many different in-firm interviews and maybe other students who have fewer in-firm interviews. So it can create this kind of sense of looking over your shoulder and what are other people doing? And then you go through the process itself and there are, dozens, if not hundreds of students walking through the streets of downtown, going through their different job interviews. And so this is a highly unusual process. And I just wanted to point that out for you because where you're sitting right now, if you're going through this process, is that it probably feels very big. It probably feels kind of like it's what you're in. It's like if you look at a fish tank, for example, you're kind of in the fish tank, right? You're in the water. And so sometimes we don't really see the situation more independently because we're so closely tied to it. And so I just want to invite to you that if we take a step back and we have that additional perspective, for you as a student going through this process, it's something that you're going to do once. You may do it more than once, but most students will do this once. And for the firms and for the schools, this is part of the annual process of helping students find positions at law firms, helping law firms find the students that will help support them moving forward. And so this is something to bear in mind as you go through the process. And I understand that it can be a little bit overwhelming. It can feel a little bit stressful. And so hopefully by preparing yourself, by listening to this podcast episode, by doing additional preparation work outside of this podcast episode, you will become more comfortable in this process, and that ultimately you'll be able to gain from this process the result that you are seeking, which is that first job at a law firm. So the third thing that I would like to highlight in this podcast episode is that I'm inviting you to play the short game and the long game. So the short game is fairly clear. The short game for most people who are going through this process is you want to find a job at the end of the process. The goal here is to find a role within a law firm where you will summer and ideally article and ideally go on to practice as an associate. And so we know that that is the short-term objective. I am inviting you to think about the long-term objectives as well. This is an opportunity for you to learn about a number of different law firms. It is an opportunity for you to meet with many different lawyers, maybe dozens of lawyers, maybe hundreds of lawyers, depending on how many people you're meeting, how many events you are going to. The idea here is for you to be learning about the legal landscape, what is out there, what you like, what you don't like, what practice areas are out there, the different styles that lawyers have. You're going to go through different offices. You're going to see how different law firms are set up. You're going to see how different boardrooms are set up. You're going to see the inside offices of many different lawyers. And so here you're having this opportunity to learn. You have an opportunity to develop your interviewing skills. So you've already gone through a number of interviews to get to this point. You've gone through OCIs. Chances are you've had other interviews that were maybe not in this particular process, but you're here, you're getting a chance to hone your interview skills. You're growing your network. With every lawyer that you meet, with every student that you meet, you are growing your network of lawyers and students who will eventually become lawyers. And some of these relationships that you're forming now will be relationships that you will maintain throughout the course of your legal career. So this is an opportunity for you not only to find a job for next summer, it is also an opportunity for you to start building your relationships. It's an opportunity for you to start building your reputation. So the conversations that you're having, the way that you engage throughout this process, all of it is an opportunity for you to be known by others, to develop relationships with others that can serve over the longer term. Now, the fourth thing that I would love to share with you, and this is probably what you're most wanting to hear about, is the preparation for the in-firm interview process itself. Now, I don't want to diminish what I have just shared with you because I think it is so important for each of you to acknowledge where you are already, to acknowledge how much work it took you to get to where you are today. I also think it's really important to recognize the uniqueness of the process that you are going through and to understand the role that it plays in the stage that you're at in your legal career. And I also think it's really important to have your eyes on not only the short-term goals, but also the long-term opportunities that come through this process. But I know that you're all wanting to know, but what do I do? How do I prepare for this process when it seems so mysterious, when they feel so much pressure to get a job by the end of it? And so there are steps that you can take that will help you feel more confident, that help you have more clarity, and that will help you navigate this process successfully. So the first step that I would recommend when it comes to preparation is one that some people may overlook. And not everybody will overlook this step, but I find many people will. And I'll just share with you what that is. And that is internal research. I'm going to talk about internal research and external research. Now, the external research, that's the second point that I'll make, is one that I think most people will do when it comes to looking for a new job. I know certainly when I work with lawyers who are looking for a new position, they've done a lot of research in terms of what roles are out there. What people tend to skip over, if they do skip over something, is the first part of the research, which is actually research that comes from you, right? It is the internal work that you do to figure out what you want out of a position, out of a law job, out of a summer position at a law firm. It is highly important to take this step because if we do not know what it is that we want, it is so much harder to then go out and find it. And the answers to this question are not going to be found in a textbook or on a website somewhere. These are highly personal questions, and I highly encourage you to ask yourself these questions. Now, this is particularly important for a student like you who is going through the in-firm interview process, because what can happen, right? When we go back to the nature of the whole interviewing process, the whole recruitment process that happens at law schools and law firms, is that you're doing it among others, right? There are other students going through the exact same process. You're having conversations, and what can happen sometimes is that you might lose sight of what you really want because you get so caught up in a process and what other people are looking for in the process from the perspective that they have going through it. And so we want to make sure that you are super clear about what matters to you, what's important to you, and what you are looking to gain from the process. So what does this mean then? What is doing that internal research? It's getting really clear about what your values are and how those values affect what it is that you are looking for in a law firm. You want to ask yourself what areas of law you want to practice in. Now, you may not know where it is that you want to practice. You may be torn between, say, litigation and solicitor work. I invite you to start exploring that question more fully. Start trying to guess at where you think you would be most content. I would invite you to think about what's most important to you within a working environment. Maybe it's mentorship. Maybe it's prestige. Maybe it's the type of files that you want to work on. Maybe it's the sustainability of the practice that you would have there. So you want to start asking yourself questions about you, right? You want to know you really well so that you can identify when a place feels like a good fit for you. Finally, you might also want to identify what it is that you want not only in the short term, but also in the long term. What are the objectives that you have for this process overall? Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that I have a guidebook. It is specific to law students who are navigating the in-firm interview process. I've got some question prompts in there to help you get to know yourself better. So again, if this is something that you'd like to go further into, I encourage you to download that guidebook. There will be a link to it with the show notes to this podcast episode. And if you cannot find it, please just send me a note and I will send you the link. So that's really step one when it comes to preparation. Know yourself first. Know what you want from the process. Know what you want from your first law job. Now, the second step is external research. So this is where you probably have already done quite a bit of work, right? You've identified the firms that you've applied to. You've done research about each of those law firms so that you had a sense of what they offered and why you would be applying to those firms in the first place. You've done OCIs, so you've had a chance to speak with lawyers and representatives from each of those firms. So you have a pretty good sense of where it is that you are going. You may have already gone through the process of additional networking, right? You may have gone to events where you met lawyers at different firms, and so you've been able to learn about the firms that way. If you're a student and you are not in the interview process yet, you anticipate that coming up maybe next year. Maybe you're even a pre-law student and you're thinking, how do I plan ahead? I highly encourage you to make every opportunity to meet with lawyers at law firms before this process begins, because that will just give you a greater sense of clarity about who is there, what type of work law firms are doing, what the culture is like at each of those firms. And it also gives law firms an opportunity to get to know you. So highly encourage all of that. And so here we are now. You have already gone through the OCI process, the submitting your CV and resume and all that process. So the next step for you in terms of external research is, what else do you want to know about the firms before you go into your interview process? So We're going to start with the firms and maybe review what you've already learned about the firms. Maybe you're going to go deeper. You might be reviewing their websites to identify what values they share on their website, what practice areas they have. You want to learn about the people at the firm. You may know already who it is that will be interviewing you. You want to learn about them. They may have information about their student programs. You want to review that information so that you know already going into the interview what the process is for students. That will allow you to ask more sophisticated questions as you go through the process. You'll also want to research the process, the in-firm interview process itself, right? What can you expect in terms of the length of the interviews? You want to know if there are any rules that are governing the process. So often there will be the rules set by the local bar association in terms of how the interviews are conducted. It may place limits on what firms are allowed to say to you. So, for example, firms may not be able to make an offer to you of employment before a certain date. And so you want to know what the rules are that govern the process itself. You want to know what it's going to look like day to day, right? How many days is it? Where are the offices located that you're going to be visiting? You want to know what the unspoken rules of the game might be. So this is a great opportunity to speak with other students, other people who have gone through the process, understand, should you give thank you notes after each interview? I recommend doing so. Are you supposed to declare your first choice? And if so, at what point of the process do you do that? And so these might be questions that you want to think about in advance. Do you want to invite yourself back or offer to come back to meet more people? If you find that you're really interested in a firm, things are going really well, you're interviewing and you're really interested, you want to find ways to further communicate with lawyers at that law firm. You might want to also think about what happens with the offers themselves when they come in and what happens if you receive multiple offers from different firms. What are you going to do if you don't receive any offers from firms? So these are all things that you want to think about in advance. What is the process? What can you expect to happen? And there are a number of sources that you can go to do this external research. So again, law firms and the process. Websites are a great place to go. So the law firm website, maybe there's a bar association website that talks about the process. You'll want to talk to your law school career advisors. Now, they may be very busy this time of year because there's lots of students going through the process. That's okay, right? That's what they're there for, and they would love to help. And so make sure you're attending whatever information sessions are available. Reach out with any questions that you have for them. Again, if there are students who have gone through the process already, they are a great resource for you. They can tell you all about the process. They can tell you, ask them questions, right? Ask them about the process itself, maybe some of the things that were surprising to them when they went through the process. What did they think was effective in the process? Where did they see people maybe getting tripped up in the process? They may have information about the firms as well, right? There will be students who have summered at different law firms and they will have information about those law firms. So reach out to them, especially if you're really interested in working at the same firm. Ask them about it. What was their experience like? Who were the lawyers that they worked with? There's opportunities here for you just to get to know what it is. You want as much information as you can possibly have about the firms, about the process, so that you're really setting yourself up with all the information that you need for this process to be fruitful for you. I would also invite you to reach out to any family or friends who are lawyers or who know lawyers or who have been through the process. They can be really helpful in terms of offering their perspectives on the whole process and what you might do to set yourself up for success, questions that you might be asking yourself throughout this process. And then finally, you're welcome to reach out to coaches, people like me who can help you gain clarity about what you're looking for, who can help you understand the legal landscape, who the different players are, what the different firms are like. So these are all ways for you to equip yourself with the information that you need in order to navigate this process successfully. Now, in addition to these ideas, I would invite you to be resourceful. One of the reasons I would encourage this isn't just for this process itself, but because when you start out as a student, when you become an articling student, when you get called to the bar and you are a practicing lawyer, you are going to come into all sorts of challenges in your legal practice, all sorts of novel situations where the answers aren't crystal clear. It can be really stressful. There are timelines, there are uncertainties. And so here, this is a really great example or an opportunity for you to practice your skills, how you navigate a situation where it is stressful, where there are rules that need to be followed, where there are ambiguities, there are unspoken rules. You want to figure out how to get good at that process, because that is a meta skill that you get to apply in the future going forward for all the challenges that come your way as a lawyer and just generally even. So be resourceful. Think about how you want to approach this in a way that leverages your skills, your strengths, and your ingenuity. So in terms of preparation, then, we've talked about that internal research, getting to know yourself. We've talked about that external research, what you need to know about the law firms and the process itself. And then step 3, when it comes to preparation, I have called this master the dialogue. In other words, practice answering and asking questions. I would invite you to treat the interview process itself. And right now, I am thinking about that actual dialogue that is going to take place between you and the lawyers and other professionals at the law firms who will be interviewing you. I would invite you to prepare as though it were a law school exam. And when I think about this, I think about some of the most successful law school exams that I wrote. Again, this is going back 20 plus years. And the best results was often to take a list of questions, to imagine what the questions on an exam might be, and then write out my answers in advance to those questions. And sometimes those questions would appear on the exam, especially if you have a teacher who's kind of giving you hints along the way, or professors, I should say, that are giving you hints along the way. So anticipate the questions and prepare your answers in advance so that you are ready for those questions. So you want to anticipate, first of all, what types of questions law firms are likely to ask you. So here are some categories that you might be thinking about. There are behavioral type questions. Now, you can look up behavioral questions. They typically go to what kind of behavior you would exhibit in a particular situation for yourself. So tell me about a time that you faced a difficult challenge. What did you do? That type of question. There will potentially be motivational questions, right? The why questions. Why did you choose to go to law school? Why are you applying to this firm? What is it about this practice area that interests you? There may be skills-based questions, right? What would you do to solve this particular legal problem? Tell me about the moot that you participated in and how you got ready for the competition. You might be asked questions that go to your personality and whether you're a culture fit for that organization, right? So they might be asking you about some of your interests or what it is that you're looking for in a law firm. You might also be asked hypothetical type questions. What would you do in a situation where? So these are different categories of questions. And again, if you would like more in-depth questions, examples of questions, I'd encourage you to download the guide that I referred to earlier. I set out a number of questions there. And don't limit yourself to the questions that I have identified. You want to think up your own questions. And the idea here is simply to start brainstorming about what you anticipate you're going to be asked in the interview process. And then I would love to encourage you to practice responding to those questions. So this could take quite a bit of time, especially if you've generated a lot of questions. And I would encourage you to invest that time. Now, you may simply run those questions through your mind and answer them in your mind. And if you do that and nothing else, that is still way better than not doing this exercise, period. But I would encourage you and invite you to take it a step further. I would encourage you to think about your answers and write down in bullet point format how you would answer each of those questions. So what would be the key point you would make in respect of each of those questions? Or maybe there's more than one key point. And once you have written out your bullet points, then I would encourage you to speak those answers out loud. So what that means is that you would potentially speak to yourself in the mirror. You could speak to your pet dog or your pet cat. Better yet, find a human who is willing to have a mock interview conversation with you. I think when you speak with a human, you're really going to see whether or not you are being conversational or if you're coming across as a little bit stiff. You'll also have a really clear picture of what answers you like and which ones you might want to modify. If you don't have anybody that you can practice with, try recording yourself on Zoom. You can open up a Zoom meeting, press the record button, and simply record yourself and go back and watch it. Don't be too hard on yourself if you do that. You'll get a sense of how you come across, how you articulate your answers. And the objective here is not that I want you to memorize a script. It is not that at all. What I am encouraging you to do is to get so familiar with your answers that when you go to respond to the questions in the interview, you already know what you're going to say. And because you already know what you're going to say, you have more of an ability to engage, to be present, to be articulate, to relax, to be yourself, so that the answers that you're giving feel really natural. Now, I do quite a few interviews of lawyers in different capacities. Sometimes I'm interviewing lawyers for my podcast. Sometimes I'm interviewing lawyers regarding substantive law for webinars. And what I notice about the most effective speakers are that they are the ones who are very clear. They are organized. And when I ask them a question and they respond to the question, I can almost see the little bullet points pop up as they explain their answers to me. It's just the way that I think. I think it's really neat. I can see that they've got 3 main points that they're making. But those points don't sound like they are rehearsed. They don't sound like the person is reading. The minute someone sounds like they are reading, whether off an actual notepad or if they are reading off some imaginary notepad in their mind, it starts to sound a little bit stiff, a little bit unnatural. It feels less conversational, and it can affect the level of connection that you have with that person. And it's very tough to balance. Now, I do a weekly podcast. This is one of them. And to prepare for my podcast, I always put together notes. So for today's podcast episode, I have 4 sheets of bullet paper that I'm referring to throughout this podcast episode. And I have to watch myself that I'm speaking to you directly as a human, as a student listening to this episode, while also following the thread of what it is that I want to say. And I find it to be challenging. And so you're not alone if you find this to be challenging. But what I would invite you to do is to get to know your answers so well that you don't need to follow a script, that you can answer these questions naturally with confidence in a way where you're still paying attention to what that person is asking you. I think sometimes we hear a question and we respond to it in a way that matches another question that maybe we prepared for. So we want to be able to make sure that we're listening to the question, we're listening to the nuances, and that those are the questions that you're responding to. And this process of answering the questions will help you just to gain clarity about what types of examples you'd want to share, what types of stories you want to share, what information about yourself you think is important to convey. All your prep will help you with that. It's also going to help you to better understand yourself, right? Going back to that question about who are you? Like, what are your values? What do you really want from this experience? As you force yourself to prepare your answers ahead of time, chances are you're going to learn a lot about what it is that you want from your first position at a law firm, and that will help you in the process itself to narrow down the firms that you think are going to be the best fit for you. So that was step 2 within this point that I'm making, which is all about preparation. So again, just going back to preparation, what we're talking about here is, first of all, prepare by getting to know yourself, doing that research. That was step 1. Step 2 was do that research externally, right? What do you need to know about the law firms? What do you need to know about the process? And then there's this step, which is identify the questions that you anticipate you are going to be asked. Then you are going to answer those questions. So I guess maybe we're on step 4. And then finally, I would encourage you to identify questions for your interviewers. So this is really important. I love it when people ask questions. I love it in day-to-day conversation. I love it if I give a presentation and somebody then asks questions at the end of the presentation. I appreciate it if I'm conducting an interview and I turn to that person and I say, "Do you have any questions?" I appreciate it when they have questions. It shows that you are engaged, right? It shows that you are interested. You may have that experience where you're in an interview and the person who has just spoken has basically answered all of your questions. You may have no questions left. I would still encourage you to find a way to ask a question. Now, if they've already answered all your questions, you might acknowledge that. You might say something like, I had a question about mentorship, but you've done such a great job of answering and telling me about the mentorship program that you have here at the firm. You may then ask a follow-up question, right? One of the things I'm interested in about mentorship is, how are they assigned? And so maybe that becomes a question that builds on what they've already shared with you about a topic that you had a question about. So you just want to look for opportunities to ask questions, even if the interviewers have already done a really great job about explaining something that you had questions about. This shows that you've been listening. This shows that you've been engaged. And the risk that you run if you don't have any questions is that the person who's interviewing you doesn't really have much information to go on then, right? They might be thinking, okay, well, I guess they did a great job explaining because they didn't have any questions. They might be thinking, well, maybe they weren't that interested in what I had to say, and so maybe that's why they don't have questions. So by asking questions or even acknowledging what that person has just shared with you, that can really help to create that dialogue, which is ultimately what you're after here. You want to create a conversation. Now, another thing that might come up during that question period, let's say they've covered something about the mentorship topic, for example, you might say it's really important. That's something that I was really looking forward to hearing about. And I'm so glad that you shared that with me because the way that you described your program is exactly what I wanted, or something like that. Other reasons why questions are really powerful: it balances the conversation. So as an interviewer, interviewers might sometimes feel like either they are asking all the questions or they're doing all the talking. And so by you participating, it shows that you are balancing out that conversation. It gives an opportunity to your interviewers to say more great things about their work, about their workplace. So one of the things that I always appreciated when I was interviewing students was that those days were really great for me as a professional, because I would often be sitting either on my own with a student or with a colleague and a student. And the more we were asked questions about our workplace, the more we were able to share about the things that we loved about our workplace, some of the opportunities that we had, why we found that that was the right firm for us relative to other firms, some of the great experiences that we'd had, what we'd seen as successful traits in others. And so it can be really positive for the interviewer to be asked questions because it's a great reminder to them about what they enjoyed about being at the firm. So it can be really great to reciprocate in that way. You can avoid the awkward silence. So I'm okay with awkward silences. I don't think they're so terrible, but sometimes it's nice to be able to hit the ball back over the court and keep that conversation flowing. So it does replace that, I don't really have anything to add to this, with something that brings the conversation or continues the conversation. It shows reciprocity in that way. And it also shows initiative, right? If you come prepared with questions and you're asking those questions, it shows that you're really taking a seat at the table. And again, when we think about what you want to demonstrate throughout this process, it's that you're wanting to show that you're an active player here, right? Like you are helping navigate this process. And so by you showing up with your questions, you are effectively doing that. So what kinds of questions might you want to be posing? They might be questions about career development. You might be asking about the culture at the law firm itself. You might have questions about work, what type of work you would be doing, how the work would be allocated. You may have questions about the firm's long-term strategic plan. You may have questions about how students are given feedback, how their performance is evaluated. So these are all areas where you may have questions. And if what you're looking for are specific examples of questions, again, I would encourage you to check out the guidebook that I have prepared. There are some sample questions in there, as well as brainstorming questions that you really would love to hear the answers to. So just to summarize then where we are at, we have talked about, the 5 things that I think that every law student needs to know about in-firm interviews. Number 1 is we are celebrating the fact that you are at this stage. We are, number 2, recognizing that the in-firm interview process is a unique process. It is serving a very specific goal. The way that it's set up can create additional pressures because you're doing it alongside your fellow students, and that is all okay. We have talked about how there is a short game and also the longer term game, and we have talked about preparation. So preparation being that internal research, right? What is it that you are looking for in particular? Step 2 was that external research. What do you need to know about the firms and the process? Step 3, mastering the dialogue. So we broke that down into questions, right? Questions that you will ask and questions that you will answer. So we started with questions that you will answer. So those were questions that you would expect the firm to ask. I encouraged you to practice your answers to those questions. Write down the answers in bullet form. Practice speaking those question responses out loud. And then finally, the third part of that, mastering the art of the question, was identifying the questions for your interviewers, right? What are the questions that you are going to pose during the process itself? So that brings us to step 5, and that is execution during the in-firm interview process itself. That is when you're going to spend a number of days in the law firms, right? You're going from firm to firm, office to office, boardroom to boardroom, meeting with different lawyers. There may be lunches, there may be dinners, there may be cocktail receptions, all sorts of situations where you're going to be navigating relationships and conversations with other people. You will meet other lawyers, you'll meet students at the law firms, you'll meet the professional development directors of the law firms, you will meet the receptionists, the assistants, you will meet other law students who are going through the process. So there will be a lot of people who you will be meeting over the course of that period. And so there are some things I would encourage you to think about during the execution stage itself. So one thing that you might ask yourself that probably isn't the first question that you would normally go to is ask yourself how you want to feel during the process. What is the emotion, the energy that you want to feel as you navigate this process? And some ideas here might be grounded, right? You might want to feel curious about the process. You may want to feel engaged. You may want to feel focused. You might want to feel relaxed. You might want to feel confident. So identify maybe 1 to 3 emotions that you would like to feel, and let that be a guide for you as you go through the process. So if you find yourself getting really stressed out, or you find yourself getting really flustered, maybe an interview didn't go very well, maybe something happened that threw you off a little bit, then we want to go back to that place, right? What feeling do you want to channel there? Maybe it's a sense of groundedness. So I just invite you to have a goal for yourself in terms of how you want to feel so that you can bring yourself to that place if things get a little hairy. Now, when it comes to execution, what I would invite you to think about is how you are demonstrating in this process what it would be like to work with you. You are demonstrating the type of professional that you are and the type of lawyer that you are going to become. And so I would invite you to think about the qualities that you would like to exhibit during this process. So some examples of what those might be. You may want to come across as being prepared. So you've done your research about the firm, you look the part, you've put on your suit, you are showing up on time, you know the process. Trustworthy, I think that is a huge quality for all professionals and lawyers in particular. And there are some easy ways to gain trust. Showing up on time is one of them. If you absolutely cannot be there on time, giving a heads up that you are running late, that something happened so that people aren't wondering where you are. Trust also means that you are authentic, you are honest, you are present. And so think about all the ways that you can establish trust with the individuals who you meet. You want to come across as smart and intelligent, so this will be reflected in the way that you respond to questions, the questions that you ask yourself. You want to show that you're a hard worker, so this will come out through the interview process where you're talking about your experiences, where you talk about, different challenges that you've had, situations where perhaps you have had a lot on your plate, where you've been managing different projects, where you've been prioritizing and just demonstrating that you are capable to work in a high pressure environment. You'll want to show your initiative and adaptability and responsiveness. So if you're receiving an email, responding to that email in a timely way. Now, you may be in another interview. You may not be able to respond to an email. You might even let people know during the interview process that you would love to hear back from them. You'd love to come in for another interview. If they do send you an email, you may not be able to respond until a particular time of day because you're going to be engaged until then. So you want to be communicating with people. Again, these are skills that you'll need as a lawyer, right? That ability to communicate, the ability to respond. And so we want to demonstrate at the interview process stage that you have those skills. Your personality, right? How do you come across? Are you positive? Are you open-minded? Are you eager? Are you interested? That will show itself through the process. You want to show that you have a certain level of confidence within yourself, right? We are not looking to establish that you are the smartest person in the room or, something that would kind of be considered arrogant. But you do want to convey confidence, right? You do want to convey that you have a sense of self-assuredness, that you will be able to figure things out, that you are keen to jump in, that you will be able to take on a project and run with it. You want to have clarity regarding what it is that you want. So this is an area, and I wanted to just mention this, that I think sometimes we can try to not narrow down what we're looking for in an effort or attempt to keep options open. So for example, you might really, really, really want to be a litigator, but you're not sure if a firm has capacity for litigators. And so you might say, well, I could be a litigator or a solicitor. That might be okay, right? If you truly, truly want to be a litigator, I would encourage you to say that and to find a place where you can be a litigator. I think when you leave your options too open, sometimes it gets harder for firms to place you, right? Firms are coming into this equation with an idea of what it is that they're looking for, right? They have a very clear understanding of who they have within their organization, where they need the most support. And so if they really, really need litigators, and then you arrive at the interview and you're super keen on litigation and they know that, and they can then say, well, this is perfect because we want, X number of students, X number of them to be litigators, X number of them to be solicitors. So if you can provide that clarity, it's actually oftentimes more helpful for the person who's hiring to know whether or not you would fit the needs that they have in the organization. So there is a benefit from a clarity perspective of being able to be more specific about what it is that you want. And I have seen some lawyers and students miss out on opportunities because they weren't able to articulate what it is with enough clarity. Now, this isn't to say that you need to know exactly what you want to do. Lots and lots of law students will be hired into positions where it isn't clear to them at the time of being brought on board what it is that they want to do. That is totally fine. But if you do have that clarity, then I would encourage you to express it. If you are keeping your options open, be clear about that too, right? Maybe it's, I'm really interested in both litigation and solicitor work. I'm really keen to be in an environment where I have access to both. I'd like to have the full service articling experience so that I can really, answer that question for myself. Or maybe you want to be a litigator, but you want experience as a solicitor through that full rotation system because you want to see what it's like for these solicitors before you ultimately conclude that litigation is what you want. So there's different considerations at play here. And what I'm inviting you to do here is to be as clear as possible when you go through that process, what it is that you want, because that's going to make it easier for them to decide whether or not there's capacity for what it is that you want to do within their organization. Other things to demonstrate during the process, good people skills. So this eventually translates into client service skills. When you join a law firm as a student, your first clients are the lawyers that you're working for. And so you want to have really great client service when it comes to your relationships with them. You also want to show engagement, right? You want to engage with the people that you are speaking with. You want to make eye contact, not super crazy eye contact, but you want to make enough eye contact. You want your voice to show that you're interested. You want to ask questions. You want to come across as curious and keen to learn. And you also want to demonstrate that you are interested in the work that the firm does. Now, this will likely be reflected in your materials, your CV, your cover letter, but also think about examples and ways to express your interest for the work that the firm is doing. What can be problematic? Again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it is that, situation where maybe you have a number of different interests, and so it might be hard for the firm to place you Another area where there might be some concerns is if you don't demonstrate interest for the work or for the people. And I understand that for some people, this may be part of your affect, right? I'm thinking here of lawyers who are perhaps neurodiverse, right? Making eye contact might be difficult for you. Maybe your tone of voice is a little bit more flat. Maybe there are ways that you communicate that are a little bit different. And so I want to acknowledge you because I really wanted to acknowledge that this process may be even more difficult for you and that it may mean trying to communicate in a way that demonstrates your interest, and it might be more challenging. And I think that things are changing for the better in a more inclusive way overall, but I don't know exactly where we're at. When I say where we're at, I mean where the process is at on that score. And so just wanted to acknowledge that that might be presenting an extra hurdle. And so just thinking about ways to show your engagement, to express your interest, to ask questions, and to demonstrate your interest in the firm and how you contribute, right? How you are, a great candidate. So other things to consider for the execution of the interview process: pace yourself, right? This is a pretty intense process. So be kind to yourself, give yourself breaks if you need them. If you can, try to schedule some time between interviews, especially if those are interviews with firms that you're really interested in, or if you anticipate there's a bit of a transition or a transit from one office to another. I would invite you to trust yourself with whatever choice you make, right? If you have offers from more than one firm and it's a really tough decision for you to make, I would invite you to really trust yourself, especially when you've done that first internal research, right? You know yourself, you know your values, you know what you're looking for. Sometimes it can be really tough. And then finally, I would encourage you to be gracious throughout the process. Be gracious with everybody that you meet, the other students, the receptionists, the lawyers that you meet with, the professional development directors. I invite you to be gracious. As I mentioned before, this really is an opportunity for you to be building your reputation within the legal community. I would also invite you to be gracious in handling multiple offers if that is the situation that you find yourself in. Be gracious if you receive no offers as well. That's also something that can happen. Be gracious with other people who are going through the process, other students. And finally, be gracious with yourself, right? This is a potentially very stressful and challenging process. It's also very exciting. And, give yourself that space. Be gracious, be kind to yourself. So that is what I had to share with you, dear student. And just wanted to say thank you for being with me throughout this episode. I'm just realizing now we're almost at an hour. And so I'm really delighted to have you here. I think you're doing a fabulous job of reaching out and looking for ways to support yourself through this process of doing the research, of doing the prep work. So good for you for joining me here today. In summary, we talked about those 5 things to do. We talked about celebrating where you are. We talked about acknowledging the uniqueness of the system. We talked about that short-term versus long-term objectives. We talked about how to prepare. So doing that research internally, doing the research externally, mastering the art of questions. So what are the questions that law firms are likely to ask of you? How will you respond to those questions? What are the questions that you are going to ask of the law firms? And then finally, how do you want to conduct yourself in the days, the actual sort of day-to-day of the in-firm interview process itself, in terms of really showing up in a way that speaks to who you are professionally and the lawyer that you are going to be. A couple of final thoughts, as you may have gleaned from this podcast episode. This whole process, this whole in-firm interview process is a wonderful opportunity for you to learn about yourself, to learn about law firms, and to set yourself up for that first real opportunity for you to be a lawyer, first a student, and then a lawyer at a law firm. And if it's what you want, if this is the role that you want, I express so much support and wish you all the best in finding that role that you are seeking. I have every confidence that you are going to navigate this process with grace and with flexibility and adaptability. And I'm so excited for you. I wish you all the best. Please tell me. I'd love to hear from you if you listened to this episode and then you applied what you learned and navigated your way to a job that you are really excited about. And if you go through the process and it doesn't end up the way that you wanted to, I also wanted to encourage you to be kind to yourself, not to worry that it doesn't need to be the perfect job. Many lawyers, maybe they have a job at the end of this that isn't their first choice, but it's still an excellent choice. It can still lead to a beautiful career. And if you don't end up fruitful at the end of this process, it is not the only way to become a successful lawyer. So I just wanted that to be on your mind as well. And in the long run, everything really does work out the way that it should. So thank you again for joining me for today's podcast episode. It has been such a pleasure to share these tips with you. I hope that you found them helpful and that you have some actionable takeaways to apply as you move forward in your in-firm interview preparation process. As I mentioned, there is that free guide, so go ahead, download that. It'll have a few more details about questions that you can ask, some questions that you can ask yourself to prepare. If you know someone who's going through this process, then please do share this episode with them. I'd love them to have additional support as well in navigating the process. And if you have any questions that I haven't responded to here in this podcast episode or in the guidebook, then by all means, please feel free to reach out to me. I would be delighted to hear from you. And if you do, as I mentioned before, if you go through this process and you find the job that you were looking for and you want to share that with me, please do. I would love to celebrate that with you. So with that, thank you again for joining me. I hope to connect with you again next week, and I wish you every success in this recruitment process and beyond. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.